Grant Field, and for connecting bus service to the Varsity and Robert First Center for the Arts. This is North Avenue Station. Esta es la estación North Avenue.
Mass transit options, such as buses and subways, naturally create environments that conflict with social distancing practices. Even ride-sharing options and other sharing economy services present problems. What does that look like in a COVID-19 world, and how do we adapt to those changes?
I'm Steve McLaughlin, Dean of the Georgia Tech College of Engineering, and this is The Uncommon Engineer.
We're just absolutely pleased as punk to have you with us. Please say a few words.
Our guest today on The Uncommon Engineer is Dr. Kari Watkins, the Frederick Law Olmsted Associate Professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Georgia Tech. Her work focuses on the pairing of technology and transportation. Welcome to the show, Kari.
Thank you for having me.
You know, we're recording this right in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and being away from work. And so if it's okay, I really just like to jump straight into your expertise, the kinds of work that you do in all things transportation, and how you see the pandemic that we're in the middle of, the kind of distant work that we're in the middle of, and how do you see mass transit changing due to what we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, I think that there's two ways to think about this. One is how transit has changed in the immediate, and one is what might happen in the longer term. And in some ways, the longer term is maybe more important to talk about at some point. But in the immediate, there's kind of a crisis going on too, right? There's a lot of people who depend on transit to get around. And when we're concerned with equity and making sure that everybody has the ability to get from place to place as they need to, and in a time like COVID, the critical workers who are trying to get places often are people who rely on public transportation in order to get there. Those are still folks who need to be able to get to work and complete other trips that they're taking. And so transit has to exist. But at the same time, as ridership declines, and some of the work that we'll talk about later, I've been looking at transit ridership for a long time. COVID's the biggest hit that we've taken in transit ridership, right? There's lots of missing riders all of a sudden. And that hit is hurting transit agencies in a lot of ways. They're not collecting as much money. And so it's harder for them to operate their services. And at the same time, they have more expenses because of COVID. They're trying to keep people safe. And so they're trying to do more cleanliness practices. And then there's even horrible stories about when passengers are not doing their due diligence of wearing masks and, things that they need to do to keep our environment around us safe. You've got things like bus drivers that are dying of COVID. New York City had some major issues around that. So in the immediate, you've got kind of all of these pieces where, there are less riders, and agencies are trying to keep people safe, and so they're facing all of that at the same time.
I'm really struck by two things. One is really the first thing that you mentioned is that so many people come from communities and situations where they have no choice. They have to go to work, and public transportation is their only option. And so it's just overwhelming to think of the situation that so many people are facing. So maybe I'll just ask my question, around that, just as kind of an engineer. Are most public transportation systems enforcing social distance from the standpoint of just reducing the number of riders, say on a bus or on a train or subway? Are they starting at that level, or do they not need to do that because people are just not showing up?
Yeah. So I think in the US, largely most places, there's not enough people for it to be a huge concern right now. So there's less riders, and so the distancing is not all that hard, right? Protecting those drivers and, the folks who are on that vehicle all day long is still really hard. And they've been doing things to make sure that in situations where there are a lot of passengers still, that people do distance themselves and that they take this stuff seriously. Outside of the US, though, there's a lot of examples of transit agencies where, even with reduced numbers, they still have a lot of people. And even in New York City, this would be true, right? New York tends to count their peer agencies as cities like London and places like that. There's a couple of models where we see that people are successfully using transit and still, staying safe. There was actually an article in City Lab just a couple of days ago about both France and Japan. I happen to teach a study abroad course in Japan, and so I know a lot more about their systems. So I've been keeping tabs on what they're doing. First of all, wearing masks. It's pretty common in Japanese society that whenever there's any kind of outbreak, everybody's got a mask on. And so you look at images of their transit system and the whole public, everybody is wearing a mask. They don't feel like they have to mandate these things because everybody just does it. They know that this is how you don't spread things back and forth. They're also doing a really fantastic job of sanitizing vehicles, and so cleanliness practices and such. That's pretty common in Japan, and I think in the US we do an okay job at that, but we really could learn from those kinds of practices to keep people safe. The other thing is there's really prevalent hand sanitizer and washing stations and things like that they're putting on transit systems. Some of the numbers, use is still down by 60%, but if anybody's ever ridden transit systems in places like Japan, there's still a lot of people on that vehicle, even with use down as much as 60%. One of the keys, though, and this is something that relates more to my work, is there's really prevalent crowding information. So they tend to send out information about where crowding is occurring. Either, over the longer term that these are the peak hours and you need to know when those peaks are, or, on a moment by moment basis. And so some of the tools that I work with, like the One Bus Away app, we're trying to help and to work with agencies to see if in the US we can also have these kinds of crowding information components so that people can spread themselves out on a time basis or on a spatial basis, so that we can keep people safer. I think there's a lot of danger for the future of public transportation with what's happening with COVID. So with people commuting or telecommuting more, this gives us, the ability, if we can work from home and things like that, there's people just simply traveling less. And that is a good thing, right? Like that, a lot of the problems of transportation, the environmental impacts and the congestion impacts and the safety impacts and all the things that we talk about all the time, those are things that are fixed by the telecommuting as well. The difficulty comes in, as transit loses ridership and there's less people that are actually using transit, then they're able to offer less service. And so it makes it harder for that to be a choice for any individual person. And you also see things like people will buy monthly passes. And if you're now only working a couple days a week, it's much harder to do things like that. So maybe you're going to choose to drive in those 2 days when you would have taken transit every day in the past. Now you're only going to work twice. If an automobile is available, you're maybe going to use that automobile instead. And so transit kind of starts to lose the battle. And a lot of my research has actually been on transit ridership change. So we were looking at these things before COVID. And so there were a lot of effects of Uber and Lyft and telecommuting and bike share and cheap gasoline and all of these things were already affecting transit ridership before COVID was happening. And now you've got COVID kind of sitting on top of that, and that's affecting all of that even more so, right? Like a few of those, maybe Uber and Lyft people are choosing even less than transit, but many of the other parts of that, people are choosing more. So then the question becomes, like, longer term, what does this actually mean? Like, how is this going to affect transit in the longer term? If people kind of get used to telecommuting and this is a common practice, then we may continue to do that. You know, it may be that I'm only commuting 2 days a week forevermore, not just, you know, as a result of COVID. And so that's going to have these longer term effects. And if people are afraid of the density of cities because of COVID, that may change transit's ability to serve those people and such. And so that's the difficulties that I think we're currently facing as an industry, is how do we make sure, because I think even if we're reducing congestion a certain amount, even if we're reducing environmental impacts and things like that a certain amount by increasing things like the telecommute, there is still a void that transit very much serves, and not just for those populations that absolutely need it because they can't afford an automobile. There's a lot of other populations that are much better off because of the existence of transit.
You didn't ask me to take my crystal ball out, but given everything that I've just heard you say, Carrie, and it turns out in the last week, okay, you know, what your advice to that kind of a thing. So, okay. Well, the New York Times has covered your research recently. And so can you talk about that work and maybe how it relates to the other things that are happening in your lab?
Sure. So the New York Times article was about a paper that my postdoc, Simon Barabee, and I had come out that was talking about the demographics of transit ridership change. So I've been spending a large part of the last couple of years looking at transit ridership change and who's leaving transit. And so in this, we were looking at, you know, what is the crux of transit ridership? And we kind of have already known this well for a long time, right? That more transit riders are non-white, more of them are carless, more of them are non-college educated. So these are the folks that we know are the backbone of the transit service, and we have to be serving. We were also curious, as transit ridership is going down, who are we losing, right? What are the demographics of the people who are leaving transit? We were also curious about some of the reasons why. So we have some follow-on work that we're still going through, looking at what are the causes of this. But this first paper that came out was about the demographics. And we looked across 4 different cities, and we were looking at a very refined level. So oftentimes we do this work and we look city by city. We were looking within these 4 cities, which were Miami, Minneapolis, Portland, and Atlanta. And these are 4 cities with some different demographics, but kind of similar sized transit agencies. Mm-hmm. And what we saw is that across the board in all 4 cities, the demographic of the riders who were leaving the most is that they were white riders. So we started to ask ourselves, okay, well, what does that mean? Even, you know, we could put income into these models and it didn't work as well. We could put other factors. We think that's tied to some of these things that I've been talking about with ridership loss to Uber and Lyft, ridership loss to telecommuting, ridership loss to bike share, ridership loss to easier car ownership. We think that demographic is kind of pointing towards those different things. And so we're doing follow-on work to see, okay, how much of transit ridership is being lost to each of these things? And we actually have a report that's going to be coming out soon that talks about the biggest hit is actually from what we call the TNCs. So Uber and Lyft are transportation network companies. That's the lingo we use in my industry. That's where the biggest loss is coming from. But telecommute is also causing part of that loss. Bike share, not as much, a little bit. And cheap gasoline is very much causing that loss. 2 big things that are going to hit transit even harder because of COVID. right? So if you look at longer term impacts, we've got really cheap gas right now. And so anybody who might be making that choice, even if they feel safe on transit, it's a lot easier to make that choice to drive. And the telecommuting, we're looking at telecommuting basically having a surge that we think is going to be very, very long lasting going forward. So all of that work ties together to trying to understand, who are the core riders, who's leaving transit right now, and then even post-COVID, like what does that mean in the longer term about how transit should react to that?
So I'm really curious because it was distinctly white, that shift. And so is that by implication, non-white, passengers don't have those other outlets? Because I think you said it wasn't tied necessarily to income, but it was access to these other outlets or other pathways. And so is that the implication? Is it that non-white riders don't have access to those other alternatives?
I think that it is. I can't definitively say that, but I think that that's a big part of it, is that the non-white riders didn't have the telecommute option as much. They maybe couldn't have afforded using Uber and Lyft to quite the same degree. Even the car ownership picture, they may be buying cars in more numbers as well, but maybe that's not as difficult or not as easy. There's another piece here, though, and this is that we're measuring these things across the demographics of a neighborhood, but you really have to take into account that the demographics of that neighborhood may be changing as well. And so gentrification may be a piece of this also. And just the way that our data worked, it was really hard for us to look at that because we were looking at a pretty short time frame. And so, there may be other things at play there as well, which is why we've stopped trying to look at the demographics necessarily, and we've started trying to look at these factors instead. And so the new work is going to be about, which of these factors are the things that are actually pulling transit ridership away.
And I know that a lot of your research has to do with bikeability. And, here being in Atlanta, I've lived in Atlanta 25 years, and I've gotten to see a really big change, maybe not as much as people would want, but a really significant change in Atlanta as a bike-friendly city. And so I'm really curious about if you'd be willing to share the work that you're doing around bikeability, either as it relates to Atlanta or just as a whole. Again, there's big cultural differences between the U.S. and other places, even just around biking.
Sure. Yeah, so a big part of the problem with cycling in a place like Atlanta is that cars tend to be kind of overbearing, right? They go fast, people are often distracted, and so there are a lot of people out there who would like to be able to bike for at least some of the trips that they're taking, right? Like it almost seems like this idyllic situation, like even the Beltline fits into this really well, is like, I'm going to jump on my bike in my cute little outfit and, go to dinner with my husband. And, like, this is how we want to live. And this is how, when I take the students to the Netherlands, they're seeing these families riding together on bikes and things like that. And there's a lot of people who would love to be taking trips like that, but they don't feel like they can because most of our infrastructure is not designed in a way that people feel safe biking from place to place. And Atlanta has made great strides in this. Lucky for me, since I've been here, although I don't think I can take a lot of credit for most of it, I help push, but the Beltline has been a huge catalyst, but the city is also working on a lot of other facilities that would make the everyday cyclist feel safer using it as a mode. And so a lot of the work that I do is looking at people's perceptions and trying to understand what makes you willing or not to actually use a bike for transportation. So, how dedicated does the infrastructure have to be? If we put you in a bike lane, is that enough? Or do we have to put some sort of protection for that bike lane, where there's bollards or something protecting you from the vehicles? And does it have to be a totally separate path? And how do we treat intersections? Like, what are the best ways that we can change design practices so that when vehicles and bikes have to interact when they get to an intersection, how is that going to work? And we do this a lot of different ways. We do surveys, but we also have an instrumented bike project that I'm working on with Chris Ladantic. And through this, we actually take measurements of how people react to the world around them. So we ask them when they feel stressed, and we're measuring all these things about what's happening as they're riding the bike. We are even using eye trackers. One of my PhD students uses eye trackers to measure different things about your gaze behavior and such to understand what is it that is actually making you fearful? What is it that you're reacting to? What can we actually change in the physical infrastructure to make you more comfortable so that people would be able to choose biking as a mode? But the truth is that we've got a lot of right-of-way that's out there. I think a good example is what happened on Ponce de Leon Avenue. This was a road where it was 3 lanes in each direction. And because there was no left turn lane, both of those third lanes functioned as one, right? So you've got 2 12-foot wide lanes that are both serving that same function of allowing people to make left turns. They narrowed that cross section so there was only 1 left turn lane in the middle and 2 lanes in each direction. And that gave them enough room to put bike infrastructure on both sides of a buffered bike lane. So they really didn't lose any capacity for vehicles in the process of doing this. The downside to that corridor is that they didn't put enough protections in for the cyclists, and the cars are still going very, very fast speeds. And so they put these things in, they didn't protect them from people parking in them, they didn't make the cyclists feel safe enough. And so there needs to be sort of the next round happening where they close a few driveways along there, where they put some sort of more protected facility in for the cyclists so that they feel like they can safely operate on a road like that. And you would see bike usage of that facility just soar. But it's those kinds of facilities, if we do them right, the cars are not losing, the bikes are gaining, and in the longer term, the whole system is becoming both more efficient and more sustainable at the same time.
What are the kinds of benefits that a society experiences?
So, I mean, the low-hanging fruit in this, right, is that these are smaller vehicles when we're biking for a trip instead of taking a vehicle where I'm just one person in this pretty large space. So the argument that I use for my students all the time is actually this beautiful graphic that's been used over and over again, where it shows a picture of 40 people in single occupant cars, 40 people on bikes, and 40 people in a transit vehicle, and the amount of space that you take up, right? So this is something that nobody can argue with. It would be great if we didn't take up the amount of space that 40 vehicles take up, right? We can use that land in other ways than if we're right sizing the vehicles that we travel in. And the bike is a very efficient size-wise vehicle for us to be able to get from one place to another for these shorter trips, for that 2 to 5 mile trip. This is a beautifully designed vehicle to do that. There's a reason bikes have existed as long as they have. So that's obviously one benefit. We could talk until we're blue in the face about the environmental impacts of this, right? That when I'm cycling. The one that I like to focus on, though, is public health benefits, and especially in a time of COVID where we're talking a lot about public health. Like, we're suddenly appreciating our public health experts in ways that we never have before. I've been interacting with the folks who do this kind of work for a long time, and they'll tell you that the public health benefits of us walking and biking and integrating those things into our daily lives so that we don't feel like we have to go to the gym, right? We don't have to go get exercise. We're sort of doing it accidentally in the way that we go about our lives. When we do that, then our overall health is benefited in so many ways. So, we're talking about reduced cancers, reduced heart disease, like all of these underlying conditions that we're worried about right now and we talk about all the time tied to COVID. These are all things that if you're biking and walking for transportation, you're going to have reduced impacts of all of those things in your life. And you can even see that play out in some of the mortality statistics in other countries where this is more prevalent than here.
Paige, what other kinds of work is happening in your lab? And also, I'd love to hear about your students and the kinds of students that find their way to your lab and their preparation and the kinds of things that they do.
Yeah, I would love to talk about my students. So some other work. So I talked a little bit about the bikeability piece. So I've got students who are working on kind of the transit ridership piece. I've also got some students that are working on perceptions of cycling. And like I said, this instrumented bike project. There's probably two more big projects that I should mention. The first of those is we're doing some work for the Georgia Department of Transportation, looking at the relationship between vehicle speed and crashes. So using crash statistics to better understand how much speeding behavior affects crashes on Georgia roadways. And the catalyst for this work is that we're trying to come up with new metrics to measure roadways. And we think actually speed is a great way to do this. So the way that we typically say that a road is performing well or not today is called level of service. And this is, you get a letter grade of A through F, and A is considered great, F is considered bad, right? Typical of our grading structure. And F is like, it's really congested. There's not enough space for the vehicles that want to be on that roadway. A means there's plenty of space for the vehicles that want to be on that roadway. But there's lots of people who have started to call into question, if we overbuild facilities where, it's essentially empty, we're saying that's a great thing, but that's not a great thing. It's not a good use of space. It encourages people to drive more. There's a lot of negatives to that. So through this work with GDOT, we're positing that speed is actually a really great metric that could replace this, because if speeds are really, really low compared to our desired speed on that roadway, it shows we have a congestion problem, right? But also if speeds are really, really high compared to our desired speed on that roadway, it shows we might not have built that facility right. We might be encouraging people to go too fast. We might have overbuilt that facility in some way. And so we're looking at sort of new ways to measure the success of roads, and even sort of looking towards things like Vision Zero, which is a phrase that in the Atlanta area we're hearing because we've just adopted our own Vision Zero policy. This is the idea that we should not be killing people on our roadway facilities, right? That any death from transportation trying to get from one place to another is too many. And so within that, we're trying to look at, well, speed is a big part of that Vision Zero, and how do we set speeds and understand the effect of speed on crashes. So I have a whole realm of research on that.
Okay, Carrie, as soon as you said speed as kind of a proxy, it's not a proxy, it's an actual measurement, it's a metric. I was expecting you to say, because I think most people, well, this person equates, that somehow higher speed was better, and you quickly dispelled that, and that there's some kind of optimum kind of speed that reflects more than just how long it takes to get from one place to another, right? It reflects all kinds of other things. It reflects safety. It reflects how well did we plan. It affects delay. So actually the honest question is like, why is speed a new way of measuring effectiveness? It's like one of those things that you explain. Now that you've explained it, it's fairly obvious, but maybe that was the issue, is that it wasn't quite that obvious. So that's a huge innovation, if you ask me. Is that how, and that's what you're known for, or that's one of the contributions that you all are making?
Yeah, I mean, we're still in the midst of this work. So we're hoping that, the things that we're doing are going to show that it actually is a pretty logical metric for them to be using, and that data is now available. I would say the reason it hasn't been a metric is that it's hard for us to measure speed on all of our facilities across the whole network, right? We're only getting to the point now where, because of GPS and all of these things, we're easily able to collect speed data. And so we can actually have this as a metric going forward. And we've been trying to work with those data sets so that we know that this is something that, like, an agency like GDOT could actually use this as a metric. So I think the other one that I really should talk about is like related to the shared economy. I have a PhD student who's working on our willingness to share. She started this work before COVID. So we, of course, are focused within the transportation realm, right? Put COVID aside for a minute. We were looking at, are people actually willing to share in vehicles of different sizes? So we know that in general, on a transit vehicle, there's a certain level of comfort that there's going to be other people around you. And that may make certain individuals uncomfortable, but in general, we're sort of willing to share that space, and it feels like a mostly safe thing. When we look towards Uber and Lyft, most people take those trips alone, right? They may travel with a group, and so they're not alone, but there's not a high willingness to use Uber Pool, Lyft Line, these sort of shared services to have a stranger in a vehicle with you. And as we look towards the future of transportation with, highly autonomous vehicles and things like that, how we design those vehicles becomes really important if we're trying to make the system as efficient as possible. We want those to be vehicles that are right-sized to the trips that we're taking. And ideally, those vehicles would not be individual, like pod-like vehicles, right? They would probably be a little bit larger, and we would have to share that space with a person to make it efficient, right? But we're trying to understand, how willing are people to do these kinds of things? Of course, like many things, COVID has turned that research project upside down. And so my student is still looking at these things, but she's now intertwining COVID into that. And how is COVID changing our willingness to share? And we're hoping over the longer term to try to understand, even past COVID, have our mindsets around being in the presence of a stranger changed as a result of us going through things like what's happening right now, right? It's one thing to think of this 1.5, maybe 2-year period, hopefully less than that, before we have a vaccine, hopefully, and, maybe we will be able to, quote, return to normal. But I think everybody agrees that there's never going to be a return to this exact same normal we were at before. And so there's a lot of questions around what are the longer term impacts. And I think this whole sharing, willingness to share may be one of those things that we really have to look at in the longer term.
Well, as we wrap up, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you here on the Uncommon Engineer. We're just incredibly lucky to have someone like you on our campus, not only with the passion that you show, but the work that you're doing and the students that you engage. So we just want to thank you for coming on the show. And I certainly look forward to seeing you around campus. So thanks so much, Kari.
Thank you.